track and field has a much more intriguing history than meets the eye. Most will think it boils down to a couple doping cases at worst, but there really is a lot more to it than that. Let's not delay this any further. You already know how these Iceberg videos work, and start off with the first layer. Roger Bannister was a British runner from the 1950s who became the first man in history to go under 4 minutes in the mile. Shortly after he broke the barrier, many others tackled it as well, and is often attributed to being one of the most influential people in the event in history. Justin Gatlin is one of the most accomplished sprinters in the world, and was a crucial asset to the US being one of the few people that could dethrone Usain Bolt. However, he's also one of the rare cases that has 2 separate doping bans leveraged against him, one of which had initially been as long as 8 years, essentially a career-ending ban. Due to his cooperation with USADA though in other doping investigations, his sentence was reduced to 4, and was able to return to the track much sooner, with the reactions being quite mixed at times whenever he won on the track.
At the moment is going to be Corbin, but on the outside, Justin Gatlin with a time of 9.92 seconds is the world champion.
Steve Prefontaine's legacy in the American distance running scene is palpable. His stubborn front-running tactics were seen as the true way to race in the sport, setting tons of American records, and had a bright future when he turned professional. Upon driving home while intoxicated, Pre would suffer a fatal crash, tragically passing away at the young age of 24. His legacy still lives on to this day, with the Pre Classic and Pre's Rock being one of many tributes to his career. The sub-2-hour project was to see if a runner could break 2 hours in the marathon with as much technological aid as possible. Eliud Kipchoge tried doing it under the guise of Nike, but fell a bit short in 2017. Ineos picked it up a couple years later, and Kipchoge would be successful this time, becoming the first man to break 2 hours by any means possible. The beer mile is pretty straightforward. Drink a 12-ounce beer every lap, and finish the rest of the race as fast as you can. The origins seem to be credited back towards the late 1980s, and the record nowadays is actually quite competitive. The current world record is 4:28 by Canadian runner Corey Belmore, someone who's already a 3:57 miler. The Fosbury flop is a high jump technique that revolutionized the event to the point where it is quite literally the only way to high jump now. Instead of the straddle or the Western roll, Oregon's Dick Fosbury saw the high jump as an opportunity to try something different, contorting his body in a way where you arch your back over, keeping your center of gravity under the bar, then you pull your legs over, and voila! Fosbury would go on to win an Olympic title, and is arguably a Mount Rushmore tier athlete in terms of the influence he brought to athletics. In 1980, a woman by the name of Rosie Ruiz won the Boston Marathon, but her result was quickly rescinded after an investigation. The main inspiration for this investigation was that she wore informal running attire, with virtually no sweat by the end, and witness testimonies would come out of her cutting the course, and the fact that she had never run a time even close to this in her life. But despite all of this, she stubbornly maintained her innocence to the bitter end. Ruiz would pass away in 2019 without a single shred of admission. Armand Mondo Duplantis is a pole vaulter from Sweden who has completely revamped the event to the point where it's now become almost on par with the more mainstream running events. What likely helped was that ever since he was an adolescent, he was breaking age world records one by one, and eventually pivoted to breaking high school records, then collegiate records, and now senior world records. Mondo still seems to be just one big ball of momentum that fans can't get enough of, and he'll definitely be attempting to defend his title at the 2024 Paris Olympics. Jesse Owens is known as one of the most versatile athletes to grace the 20th century. At the 1935 Big Ten Championships, he set 3 new world records and tied another in a 45-minute span. The 3 new ones were the long jump, the 220-yard dash, and the 220-yard hurdles, and he would tie the 100-yard dash record as well. The long jump record in particular would last just over 25 years on top of that. If that wasn't good enough, Owens would replicate this level of excellency by pulling off the quadruple gold at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, besting his competition by notable gaps in most of the events. Owens' athletic career, though, would ultimately be ended not long after failing to show up for a post-Olympic exhibition meet in Sweden, as he was instead receiving endorsement deals to capitalize off of his Olympic success. Finland's Paavo Nurmi is a staple in distance running folklore. Depending on who you talk to, he'll even make his way into the conversation as the greatest distance runner of all time. Nicknamed the Flying Finn, Nurmi was a man who was incapable of losing in many disciplines and is the only track and field athlete in history to pull off a quintuple gold, doing so at the 1924 Olympics. He also broke 22 official world records, held a one-of-a-kind combination of world records that is yet to be seen to this day, and was overall just a jarring force to be reckoned with whenever he stepped on the track. Kelvin Kiptum was a marathoner who rewrote the history books on how to run the event. His 201 debut in Valencia was a complete anomaly of a debut, and then he went 2 steps further, running 201.25 in London, and then 2 flat 35 in Chicago, shattering Eliud Kipchoge's world record. While he quickly took over the title as the fastest man in this highly recognized and brutally competitive event, Kiptum would tragically pass away in a car crash at the young age of 24. Devin Allen was a legitimate contender to win a world title at the 2022 World Championships in the 110-meter hurdles. After false starting by 1/100th of a second, this quickly developed a discussion regarding the validity of the rule to begin with many concluding that it not only needs a rework after further research, but that Devin Allen should have never been DQ'd in the first place. Double threshold training, spearheaded by the Norwegians, is essentially the concept of doing 2 hard sessions in a single day. The idea, though, is that since threshold work is so aerobically stimulating without going overboard, you can afford to do this twice a week for a total of 4 workouts, with a speed workout on Saturday too, normally in the form of hill repeats. In the last few years, double threshold has made its way into various pro groups around the world in some fashion, as the old school method of hammering 2 max effort, or VO2 max workouts a week, is much less prevalent nowadays in modern distance running. Wavelight technology is a recent type of pacing aid that allows runners to follow a set of LED lights set at a very specific cadence. These are at most major races like the Diamond League and Continental Tour ones, where a set of blue and green lights aid athletes into break-in facility, national, or even world records. A recent study does suggest that these lights have ergogenic benefits. In other words, provide an athlete a slight advantage towards breaking records than traditional pacemaking strategies done years back. Some fans welcome and enjoy the new technology, while others feel like it can devalue a world record a bit. At the 2000 Sydney Olympics, Australian athlete Cathy Freeman was given the privilege to light the torch at the Games. With an unparalleled amount of pressure on her to win the 400-meter title, she made the unconventional decision to run the final in a full bodysuit. Despite being slightly behind with 100 meters to go, Freeman takes the gold in what is now known as one of the most theatrical wins in athletics history. Super shoes and super spikes are a new generation of footwear that are designed to help athletes get as much energy return as possible when they run. Whether it's the carbon fiber plates or the fancy bouncy foam implemented, these shoes have essentially become the standard when it comes to competing at the world stage, and now every major shoe company basically has their own version, primarily on the road side of things. Billy Mills was an American runner who had great placements in college, but didn't start turning some heads until he made the Olympic team in 1964. He would go toe-to-toe with the best of the world, many of which had notably faster times than him, which included the world record holder, Ron Clark from Australia. Mills not only stayed with the lead pack the entire time, but came out of nowhere in the final straightaway to miraculously pull off what is now known as arguably the greatest upset in athletics history. This race also includes one of the most manic and iconic sound bites ever recorded in an Olympic final too, one of which, funnily enough, got commentator Dick Bank fired for his ecstatic attitude towards Mills.
Look at Mills! Look at Mills! Coming on! Mills is coming on!
At the 2021 Tokyo Olympics, Italy's Gianmarco Tamberi and Qatar's Moutaz Essa Basham were tied at 2.37 meters, and were also both tied on the countback rule. After both failed to clear the next height, a jump off was the next alternative to decide who won the event, where they could either try to clear the next height, or would go back down to another height and see how early they could clear that one. Barsham proposed that the two shared the medal, and as soon as the official confirmed it was an alternative that was possible, Barsham immediately turned to Tamberi and said, "History, my friend," confirming the first shared gold in track and field since the 1912 Olympics. Similarly, at the 2023 World Championships, America's Katie Moon and Australia's Nina Kennedy ran into the exact same situation in the pole vault. Due to the sheer exhaustion and risk required to keep jumping while frankly dead tired, the two ultimately agreed to share the medal, marking the first time at a World Championship event a gold medal was shared. Citius Mag is a passion project turned successful track and field organization by former Sports Illustrated writer Chris Chavez. Their approach to bringing a more accessible form of media coverage to the sport of track and field has proven to be wildly successful in the last couple years in particular. They've secured candid interviews with former and current world champions, have covered dozens of national or world-class events in person, and will also provide behind-the-scenes footage of some of these athletes at times. As of now, they're continually expanding their brand with the help of additions like the Magic Boost and more, and will likely be making their formal Olympic debut as a company at the 2024 Paris Olympics. Edwin Moses was a 400-meter hurdle specialist who put a clinic on the professional scene in the 70s and 80s. From 1997 to most of 1988, Moses did not lose a single 400-meter hurdle final, as his win streak of 107 finals in a row would ultimately be broken at the 1988 Olympic Games, grabbing the bronze and retiring right then and there. During this time, he also broke the world record on 4 separate occasions, lowering it from 47.64 to 47.02. To this day, no professional athlete has come even close on the track side of things to replicating this level of dominance. Sebastian Coe and Steve Ovett is considered one of the most iconic rivalries athletics has ever seen. Born from the same country, ran the same disciplines, but were so drastically different personality-wise that some considered it a rivalry within a rivalry, especially when they were against each other at the Olympic stage. Even though the two were very obviously competitors, they actually spent much more time competing against each other statistically than directly against each other. In a mile race in 1980, Ovett had entered last minute with Coe already registered to race. Coe, who was later found out to have had an Ovett avoidance clause written into a contract of his, quickly switched to the 800, where the two won their races in their respective disciplines. While the two have expressed respect for each other years later, it's still a bit hard to decipher why the two refuse to race each other so often. Alberto Salazar is a coach who was the head of the Nike Oregon project, arguably the mecca of distance running back in the 2010s. Following a ban from USADA for trafficking testosterone, among other things, he also received a lifetime ban from Safe Sport for essay practices. He still maintains his innocence to this day, and I have a documentary on him on the channel if you want to learn more about the situation yourself.
.420 is not fast for a high school mile. It's just not fast.
Is a quote by former coach of Newbury Park, Sean Brosnan. The logic behind this quote was that if you tell your kids X time is fast, then they will simply settle for that and nothing more. But other coaches allegedly didn't see that side of it and were quite angry with Brosnan in the end. Nowadays you'll come across different versions of this quote, mainly with the intention of parodying it. Noah Lyles ran what is technically the only documented sub-19 200-meter time during a low-key meet in 2020. However, this was due to the fact that the starters put him on the wrong starting line, giving him a 15-meter advantage, and is now looked at as one of the funnier blunders of the just as strange 2020 season. Boston University's indoor track is the equivalent of what super shoes provide to road racing. The wooden base of the track combined with its high bank angle has made it a hot spot for anyone trying to run a fast time anywhere from the mile to 5,000. There's a great article written about this track that I would suggest checking out, and a video on it that provides some visuals as well. Chris Solinsky's 10,000 meter American record is one of the most iconic race videos that exist out there. What was initially a simple tempo workout would eventually turn into Solinsky accidentally becoming the first American to break 27 minutes in the 10,000, upsetting the favorite Galen Rupp and decimating the American record as well. Abebe Bikila is arguably the most influential runner in Ethiopian running history, claiming the country's first ever gold medal and winning the marathon in back-to-back Olympics. The most unique part wasn't just winning such a prestigious competition twice in a row, but the fact that he had done so during the 1961s without the use of conventional footwear, or rather, any footwear at all. Not only that, but he broke the world record alongside. Bikila would eventually transition to proper road running shoes, which did seem to unlock tremendous potential, because when he came back to win the 1964 Olympic marathon, he shattered the new world record beyond belief. Bikila remains as a beacon and inspiration to Ethiopian runners to this day. Shelby Houlihan, the current 1,500-meter American record holder, received a 4-year doping ban back in 2021 for nandrolone. Her reasoning for the positive test was that it came from a pork burrito that she ate, and to this day people still poke fun at what people perceive to be a bogus reason. Shelby plans on returning to competition in 2025. Su Bingqian's 100-meter semifinal run at the 2021 Olympics includes the fastest ever 60 meters run by a human of 6.29 seconds, setting the new national record for China in the 100 meters too. If this mark was recorded during an indoor 60-meter race, it would be worth 1334 on the World Athletics scale, a mark that would be considered the 4th greatest sprinting performance ever. At the 2012 US Olympic trials, the women's 100-meter final produced what is now known as the closest race in track and field history. Normally at these trials, the top 3 in each final will go to the Olympics, assuming they already have the Olympic standard. Originally, Jenna Tarmo had upset Allison Felix for the spot, but upon a second review of the race, it was actually declared a dead heat or a tie. Since you can't send 4 athletes to the Olympics in one event, USATF officials were scrambling for a way to settle the tie, and they came up with 2 things. Either they can do a runoff or flip a coin. If neither can agree on a decision, then the coin flip takes priority. Felix and Tarmo originally agreed to a runoff, but Tarmo would later pull out of not just the runoff, but would forfeit her Olympic spot entirely, stating a lack of desire to run given she felt like her spot was robbed from her. Tarmo would run in the heats of the 4x1 at the Olympics, where the team would ultimately win gold in the finals. The 1988 100-meter Olympic final, aka the dirtiest race in history, is one of the most well-documented cases of corruption in the sport of athletics. While Ben Johnson, the original winner, was banned and stripped of his medal, others had gotten off scot-free despite failing drug tests, including 9-time Olympic champion Carl Lewis. Lewis had gone on record in 2004, stating that hundreds of American athletes were getting off with a slap on the wrist, and that he acknowledged he failed 3 separate drug tests during the 1988 Olympic trials. Although Lewis says his test results were because of an herbal supplement he took, and not for any advantage. Johnson has spoken publicly numerous times in recent years about what he feels like was a complete injustice to not only his career, but how the governing bodies will favor specific athletes of the sport as a whole. In 1992, Ethiopian talent Haile Gebrselassie was well on his way to winning the 10,000-meter title at the World Junior Championships. Upon passing the second-place finisher, Josephat Machuka, he punched Gebrselassie in the back of the head and was promptly disqualified. Machuka has since publicly apologized and deeply regrets his actions from back then. In 2017, Fancy Bear, a Russian hacking organization, leaked medical documents from the IAAF, the governing body for athletics, that include a myriad of prolific distance runners, including Sifan Hassan, Galen Rupp, Asbel Kiprop, Evan Jager, and Mo Farah. They were all listed as likely doping or that their passport was suspicious, but the only one to ever receive a ban would be Kiprop in 2019. The rest, which were associated with the now-defunct Nike Oregon project, have never been charged with anything, nor have they ever even addressed this document in any capacity. Sha'carri Richardson, the reigning world champion in the 100 meters, is no stranger to controversy, but perhaps one that got swept under the rug rather quickly was when she got kicked off a plane when arguing with a flight attendant about her recording on the plane. Following what would turn into a heated interaction, many passengers wanted her off the plane, where Sha'carri would be kicked off, and she would call one of the passengers fat in the process, and that she's a superstar that could get a private plane anyways.
Okay, but it will. It will. Bye-bye. And you're fat. What the fuck? And I'm still a superstar. What the fuck is your problem? You're a regular person. What the fuck? Get off the plane. Because I can buy a private plane, dumbass.
The somersault long jump was a technique used by New Zealand athlete John Delamere. The logic was that instead of fighting against the motion of falling forwards, you would instead complement the forward motion with a somersault. At the Collegiate Pacific Championships in 1974, Delamere tried the technique out and jumped 7.70 meters, and would have been 840 had he completed the somersault more efficiently, which would be the longest ever seen at a non-altitude event. The ban on this technique was very swift, as the very next year it was banned by the Olympic Committee and has remained as such ever since. University of Texas runner Brendan Hebert hopped into a high school state cross-country meet a few hundred meters in, finished second, and popped his jersey as he came across the finish line. Following a strange interview with MileSplit, no one could figure out why he abandoned the race and caught a tremendous amount of flack for it as a result. Eventually, he would go on a YouTube channel discussing the whole situation and simply stated that he did it as a joke and that he had no regrets about doing it. Germany's Uwe Hahn holds a record that by all accounts cannot be beaten today. In 1984, he was on an absolute tear of phenomenal throws and had even thrown 99.52 meters to become half a meter away from breaking the 100-meter barrier. After throwing 104.80, this was a mark that not only altered the expectations of the event's potential, but is argued to be a part of the reason why the spear itself was subject to changes. The IAAF already had plans to change the javelin due to it landing flat too many times, but the fact that Hahn's record landed nearly outside of the stadium led many to believe that this ultimately sped up the process to, well, nerf the spear. Since then, the closest anyone's gotten to 100 meters with the new spear is Jan Železny, who threw 98.48 in May 1996. Paula Radcliffe's history as one of the best marathon runners to ever live is a legacy that remains a controversial one to this day. However, among the doping accusations lies a part of her career that is arguably just as memorable as her world record in the event, but certainly not as glamorous. The 2005 London Marathon, from what I can find, does not exist in full, nor does it really exist in any sufficient capacity. If you were to search this video up on YouTube, you would find, this. Now, contrary to what the title wants you to believe, Paula's number 1 shown here is actually a number 2. You can zoom in if your heart desires to figure that one out, but alternatively, you can just find an interview of Radcliffe admitting what happened, citing eating a bit too much food beforehand as the likely source of her accident. Brush spikes were racing shoes designed by Puma. They were created with the intention to provide amazing grip to the track no matter the weather, something that would help tremendously in the 2 and 400 if it rained, for example. However, right after Vince Matthews broke the 400-meter record in 1968, they would ultimately be banned for a pretty superficial reason actually, and Matthews' record would ultimately be rescinded. Anita Włodarczyk is a hammer thrower from Poland who, from a statistical standpoint, is easily one of the greatest track and field athletes to ever live, and probably the greatest female thrower to ever live too. Her 3 Olympic titles and 4 World Championship titles are beyond impressive for sure, but if you dig a bit deeper into the all-time lists for the hammer throw, she occupies 8 out of the top 10 farthest throws in history and 18 out of the top 25. Despite almost being in her 40s now, Włodarczyk still competes to this day, and was even at the last World Championships, but unfortunately didn't make it out of the qualifying round. World best is a term used by World Athletics to define a time as the best in the world in an unconventional, non-Olympic event. World record, on the other hand, is the traditional term that is used when ratifying top-of-the-line marks in the conventional disciplines. For an event like, say, the 2-mile or the 2,000 meters, World Athletics would use world best instead to describe Jakob Ingebrigtsen's records. Or bests. Would you use records? Bests? It sounds weird, I know. You can see why this term has brought a bit of confusion to fans in the past, and some have argued that the Federation can do without the term. But some will argue that it has its place in defining records that are in non-standardized events. At the 2007 Golden League Rome meet, Finnish thrower Tero Pitkämäki would launch a javelin outside of the sector near the long jump area. This alone wouldn't be an issue assuming the area is cleared out, but unfortunately, it would not only make its way towards other athletes, but managed to impale French jumper Salim Sadiri. At first, doctors had said the javelin had narrowly escaped Sadiri's vital organs, but it would be revealed a couple days later that the javelin had made contact with them, even leaving a slight tear in one of his kidneys. Sadiri would surprisingly return back to competition by next year, made the Olympic team again, and went on to have a solidly successful career. When you go to the Wikipedia page for the 100-meter world record progression for women, Florence Griffith-Joyner, or Flojo's mark, has an asterisk next to it. This is because in the 90s, a study was done by Nicholas P. Linthrone where he concluded that without a shadow of a doubt, Flojo's 100-meter world record of 10:49, that still stands today, was wind-aided, meaning that she had such a large tailwind that the record could not be deemed legitimate. You can find a lot more inconsistencies throughout this study that really do highlight just how unlikely it was that her record was not only wind legal, but somehow had no wind recorded at all. The report was made for the IAAF specifically to look at, but for some reason this record still remains grandfathered into the all-time list. If we weren't to count this record, Flojo still would have held the world record for quite a while. But realistically, it likely belongs to Jamaica's Elaine Thompson-Herah, where she ran 10:54 at the pre-classic in 2021. FloTrack is currently the biggest media company for track and field at the moment. Its debut as a resourceful media site, though, can actually be attributed to an American half marathon record set by Ryan Hall back in 2007. It was almost unheard of to livestream races like this, and for FloTrack to get such an iconic record in real time gave the founders some serious credit and momentum moving forward, and this single video can be attributed as the birth of FloTrack and really the Flow Sports brand entirely. The same year as the IAAF leak, a Reddit post would go viral showcasing that out of every top man that has run 9.8 seconds or under in the 100 meters, all of them had received a ban for doping, except for Usain Bolt. Some assess that Bolt was categorized in the too big to fail category to ever be busted for doping, whereas others will state that he was a clean athlete and was simply better than these men while doing it. At the 1991 World Championships in Tokyo, 2 world records were broken, one of which still stands today. The former was Carl Lewis in the 100 meters, running 9:86, and the latter being Mike Powell's 8:95 in the long jump that dethroned the long-standing record of 8:90 back in 1968, held by Bob Beamon. The issue was that after some tests done on the track, they found that it was unusually hard, something that helps sprinters since the track doesn't need to absorb as much power from their legs. Conversely, the women's 10,000 meter winner, Liz McColgan, expressed complaints that she was unusually sore after her win due to the rough surface. The problem was that before the performance requirements came out for modern tracks, the Japanese government had already built this track for the World Championships. Some will argue that the record shouldn't count, but others will argue that it was technically within the rules since the IAAF wasn't equipped to sanction the Tokyo track at the time. The Crouser slide is a recent shot put technique devised by American shot putter Ryan Crouser. The conventional rotation method of throwing allowed him to throw otherworldly marks which included breaking the world record, but Crouser went ahead and took the physics of the event one step further. By starting at a slightly different position in the circle and using a more explosive stepping method, this allows him to generate slightly more power as a result. Given Crouser's recent throws have continued to push the event beyond what humans have ever done, it's pretty safe to say the Crouser slide is here to stay, and will likely see more prevalence at the Paris Olympics. Mahdi Makisi Benabad is a French steeplechaser who is regarded as one of the most controversial middle distance runners in the last couple decades. While his resume is certainly a fantastic one on the track, it seems like his aggressive demeanor would get him into trouble on more than one occasion. In 2010, he would have a mascot kneel after he finished his race and proceeded to push it down into the ground. Then in 2011, he would throw punches with another French athlete after a 1500-meter race. Then in 2012, he got himself tangled in yet another mascot controversy, shoving said mascot who ended up being a 14-year-old girl. And finally, in 2014, he would take his jersey off in the home stretch of the European Championship steeplechase, showboating his way to a gold medal. Out of these instances, Makisi Benabad has faced reprimands for the teammate assault in 2011 and the showboating in 2014. Marion Jones was one of the most versatile track and field athletes to ever exist, as her meteoric rise to the scene shocked the 90s as she won 3 gold medals at the 2000 Olympics, with 2 other medals in the 4x1 and long jump. After Jones's boyfriend at the time, Tim Montgomery, had been investigated and found guilty by USADA, Jones eventually admitted to taking PEDs herself and would be sentenced to 6 months in prison. However, down the line, Victor Conte, the mad scientist behind the Balco scandal, would eventually reveal what is supposedly a doping calendar for Marion Jones, displaying the various drugs and timeframes she would utilize to her full advantage, and to skirt the anti-doping system by any means possible. Differentiation of sexual development, or DSD athletes, are an incredibly rare category of athletes. For women, it traditionally means that they possess a lot more androgenic properties, which allow them to produce much more testosterone than the average woman, providing an inherent athletic advantage. The 2016 women's 800-meter final was a huge eye-opener for the IAAF, as all 3 medalists were found to have had a specific karyotype and had testosterone levels to that of a regular male. By 2019, an official rule was put into effect, which barred all 3 of these athletes from competing in this event further. Caster Semenya, the most dominant of these athletes, tried to argue that her human rights were violated. And in 2023, the Swiss courts did assess that Semenya's human rights were indeed violated. As of now, though, the DSD regulations that prevent athletes like Semenya from competing in specific events will likely remain in place unless something drastic happens down the line. The 2020s has been a strange decade, and Sedona Poopgate was no exception. Basically, someone had defecated near the bleachers in the stadium at the Sedona Red Rock High School track, a facility professionals use for hard sessions when they are traveling down from their altitude camps. The list of suspects is minimal, but there have been a few likely-ish candidates that may or may not have done it. But to this day, no one has fessed up and no one has ever been formally punished. The sub-4 mile is one of the most sought-after accolades a runner can possess, but there are actually publications of multiple men allegedly breaking the barrier in the 1700s. Obviously, these are either misreported or just outright fabricated, but it is interesting to see that even in the 18th century, there were people seeing just how fast they can run a mile. Ma Juren is one of the most controversial coaches in athletics history by far. Responsible for some of the most accomplished Chinese athletes in distance running history, his past of allegedly providing his runners exceedingly harsh doping cycles, physically beating them, and prescribing them training regimens beyond what any sound athlete would do, he was eventually fired from coaching after multiple athletes had failed drug tests before the 2000 Olympics. Wang Junjia is credited as the most consistent and outspoken victim about the culture Ma fostered, and her husband even wrote a book going into further detail about what happened behind the scenes. I actually own this book, but I can't read Chinese to save my life, but I will eventually get around to translating it to give a more comprehensive overview about this entire debacle in the future. Age cheating is the theory that countries are allegedly competing at junior sports at a much older age to win medals or to gain scholarships. Actual evidence of these is far and few, especially in athletics, but you will come across this theory occasionally when it comes to massive prodigies in sports. Lasse Viren is a Finnish runner who is regarded as one of the greatest of all time. His double Olympic gold in the 1972 and 1976 Olympics was a one-of-a-kind feat at the time, and he had also broken the 5 and 10,000 meter world records as well. After the 1976 Olympics, though, allegations of blood transfusions began to make their way towards Viren. Depending on your view of elite sports already, his responses to the media can be interpreted in two ways. One can be an admission shrouded in blatant sarcasm, and the other can be a response to just get the press to leave him alone. Given this absurd progress from a mid-pack European championship runner to undoubtedly the greatest in the world in a single year, it's likely some sort of blood-building protocols were present in Viren's system, but of course we'll never technically know in the end. Runnerspace, another major media outlet for athletics, actually has a section of the website that hosts what are these archaic flash games. You could play mini golf, roulette, duck hunt dog, and more. Just recently they took it off their menu, it seems, but if you search it on Google and use a Flash Player plugin, you can still play these games like you are back in second grade computer class. New Generation Track and Field was a media group with the goal of providing a more modern approach to mainly distance running coverage. While the group had great success during the COVID era and were partnering with major brands in recent years, they would ultimately come under hot water after a photo shoot came out that really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, mainly because the people in question were high school girls. This ultimately led people to do more digging, and they would find a slew of red flags, the worst being that a member of New Gen was allegedly grooming a former camp member from one of the camps they hosted. Since then, the company has gone entirely defunct, but a rumor has it a new company, Sova Running, may be the resurgence of the group, or at the very least, are borrowing tons of elements from New Gen to kickstart their own content company. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, Russia became a notable force again in athletics. However, documents would leak of the IAAF participating in a massive cover-up scandal where they essentially allowed Russia to run a state-sponsored doping program so severe that the hematology profiles of some of these athletes displayed some of the most egregious values the federation had ever seen. Lamine Diak, who was at the time the president of the IAAF, was arrested in 2015 among other officials, and Diak was sentenced to jail for 4 years in 2020. Diak would pass away in December 2021 at age 88. Klecker miles are a concept that involves running sub-6-minute miles, primarily during non-workout days. To a vast majority of athletes, this would be their steady state, threshold, or even their race pace. But for On Athletics' Joe Klecker, you'll find these types of miles during normal, mid-week easy runs, and you'll definitely find plenty during his long run days too. Nowadays, under the comments of every Joe Klecker Strava post, you'll even find people keeping tabs of how many Klecker miles were run throughout the year. James Hogue was a notorious criminal in the 1980s and 90s who had quite the knack for theft. In his earlier days, though, identity seemed to be the main target for his thieving practices. In 1985, he enrolled at Palo Alto High School in California, claiming to be an orphan from an entirely different state. The 25-year-old, posing as a 16-year-old, would run at a cross-country meet where he would deviate from the finish line last second, despite being in first place, and quickly disappeared without a trace, leaving many Californians confused. He was eventually exposed for his real age, and then quickly fled town. A few years later, he would pull off something similar at Princeton University, despite being on parole, where he'd also logged some notable performances for the Ivy League team, before being exposed again and arrested for taking scholarship money. Hoke has maintained his criminal status as late as 2016, where he again gave a fake name when being charged with a misdemeanor. Despite Mo Farah being the most accomplished championship distance runner in the world, his past is as sketchy as it gets, with really too many instances to count. One that stood out quite a bit was in 2019. Farah had been accused of assaulting a married couple at a gym in Haile Gebrselassie hotel. Gebrselassie acted as a mediator and prevented Farah from getting any charges, and according to the husband in question, he said the wife was never struck but addressed that Farah had kicked him in the neck. Every article about this, though, more so concerns Farah's stolen goods. That happened while he was at the hotel too, as thousands of dollars and a watch had allegedly been stolen from a bag in his hotel room while he temporarily left. While many of the hotel staff were taken into custody for weeks, they were eventually released due to a lack of evidence. And Gebrselassie even goes on to note that Farah had not paid a $3,000 service bill for staying at the hotel, and that there were even more reports of misconduct Farah and his associates were guilty of. Despite legal action being hinted at the very end of Gebrselassie' statement, no updates have been made to this situation as of writing this. Barra basca is a unique throwing technique in the javelin that originated in Spain in the 1950s. It's basically like converting the shot put event to a javelin throw, and this technique temporarily skyrocketed the world record barrier to the point where the IAAF immediately put a ban on it. Some speculate that this technique was to be used in secret in order for Spain to take over the 1956 Olympics, but obviously word spread across quickly. There were allegations of safety issues as well, to where very few throws were actually landing in the sector, but I have yet to find any legitimate corroborations of this claim. But nevertheless, it is kind of believable when you see just how reckless this technique is. David Torrance was a Peruvian-American distance runner whose legacy remains in the hearts of those who loved him to this day. But his death is one that leaves said loved ones perpetually confused. While the official declaration for his death was accidental drowning, close ones to Torrance immediately became suspicious given he was a notably good swimmer to begin with. They noted that Torrance had been receiving death threats the year before his death, and that most authorities involved seemed to have handled the case very inefficiently. Others further speculated that because of Torrance's whistleblowing on controversial coach, Jama Aden, that there may be something linked with that too. There's a lot of theories on what could have caused Torrance's incredibly tragic death, but as it currently stands, its official ruling remains as an accidental drowning. While switching nationalities isn't anything new in track and field, there have been some notable victories in recent years, primarily from young Kenyan or Ethiopian women, representing countries like Bahrain, Kazakhstan, and Israel. Turkey was also a common-ish country of choice back in the 2000s, but that didn't seem to work out very well. Wins and solid placements from athletes like Ruth Jabet, Winfred Yavi, Nora Gerudo, and a couple others seem to have raised some red flags in how these women were originally recruited, as some were sent off to these countries before they were even over the age of 18, along with the fact that some of them have tested positive for doping as well. Some have assessed that not only are these particular instances ethically questionable, but some have pushed it as far as potentially grooming, or at worst, on the cusp of trafficking. Others have tried to look at it from a more innocuous angle, as they do think it's possible that some of these women are simply taking advantage of their talent to make money for their family back home, even if it means not being able to represent their home country. In the 1980s, East Germany, the Soviet Union, and others ran some of the most robust and brutal doping protocols for women's sports we will probably ever see. Athletics were one of the main targets for these countries, more successfully the throwing events, and this resulted in records that are rated from a raw performance standpoint as the greatest performances in human history. The discus record is rated at 1382, and the shot put is at 1372. To put this in perspective, these beat Usain Bolt's records by over 20 points, and those are already considered to be near the peak of human achievement. Even though elite throwers likely aren't entirely clean today, there's just simply no way they would ever be allowed to, nor would they want to utilize the catastrophically dangerous doping protocols these women were on back in the 1970s and 80s. But unfortunately, this is just what was required to break these records, as the discus and shot put all-time lists for women have remained virtually unchanged for the last few decades. Asbel Kiprop is one of the most talented and accomplished 1500-meter runners in history. His ban in 2019 was a harsh stop to his career, but over time, much more devious acts would surface from the Kenyan. Kiprop had been documented to have cheated on his wife, which actually has video evidence crazily enough, but what's much worse than that is that he was alleged to have kidnapped someone under the age of 18 and threatened the life of a woman he had been seeing, which I guess according to this article was 16 at one point. As someone who delved into Kiprop's criminal history, it's pretty bad from what I've researched, and he seems to not show any remorse and is generally frowned upon in his area as well. In 2021, a private investigation was done on Alberto Salazar and Galen Rupp. Salazar at this point had been permanently banned from coaching, and Rupp's talents were under the guise of Coach Mike Smith. The purpose of this investigation was to see if there was any evidence Salazar and Rupp were still communicating with each other in any fashion, something that could constitute foul play under the current WADA rules of association. The PI didn't find any damning evidence, as the only things that are currently public about it are pictures of Rupp going about his daily life and mentions of Salazar with his family. Rupp was found training at a house owned by Salazar's wife, but that's as far as it goes. What's a little bizarre is that the only media outlet to cover this report is independent news organization and forum Let's Run. Whether it just didn't make its way to any other companies, or that other news outlets didn't see a reason to report it, remains a question unknown. It should be worth noting that the article about this report is locked behind a paywall, and frankly is written with a cliffhanger to basically get you to pay $10 to see it. Which, spoilers, it's really not much. Tim Danielson was the second high schooler in history to break 4 minutes in the mile. Despite being one of the biggest talents the sport had to offer during this era, he disappeared years later with not much rhyme or reason as to why he retired so abruptly. A reunion for Danielson's accomplishments was set to take place in 2011, but this excitement to meet the accomplished Californian star was quickly met with disbelief, as an email was sent that Tim Danielson had taken his wife's life. The details are pretty grueling, but Danielson was eventually sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. Yolanda Balash might be considered the greatest athlete of all time depending on who you talk to. Her 154 win streak in the high jump is the longest win streak in athletics by far. She broke the world record tons of times, and she was using an outdated technique on top of that. However, after her abrupt departure from the 1966 European Championships, many began to speculate if she was, frankly, a man based on the fact that these championships were the exact moment mandatory sex tests had been introduced. Balash has obviously denied these allegations, but Olympic champion Marichka Puica, who is from the same country as Balash, suggests that not only was Balash likely not a biological woman, but that she apparently had a kid to mask any suspicions right after she retired. Balash credits her retirement to an injury, which would actually make sense given she was at an age where optimal explosivity for the high jump can slow down, and her win streak was broken too. overall we'll likely never know, because even if there is a precedent for athletes failing sex tests around Balazs's era, it's a pretty bold assumption to make at the end of the day. In the depths of running message board, Let's Run, there's a specific section of the forum dedicated to its paid members only section. During the month I had one for research purposes, I stumbled upon a pretty interesting and kind of funny hate phone call that an admin themselves posted. There's not much I have to say about it personally, but I'll play parts of it to give you an idea.
Hi, I'm a longtime regular on Let'sRun.com, and I'm just calling to say that just because you guys have a corporate office and 1-800 number doesn't mean that you guys are big time now or that you actually know anything about running. Basically, all that Let's Run is a bunch of liberal bitches who mouth off and act like experts when most of them don't even know anything about their own discipline. Everything they think they know. I'm sick of every time I post something on Let's Run, it gets deleted just because it's not liberal. The f*** is up with that? Okay, my people at work are thinking I'm crazy now. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Eilish McColgan, Britain's multinational record holder in multiple disciplines, would unfortunately be the victim of a cyber attack on her iCloud account, as multiple promiscuous clips of her and her boyfriend would be leaked. Authorities would be brought into the mix, but cybersecurity experts were not able to find any meaningful traces of the suspects. Abortion doping is a concept that dates back to the 1950s and 60s, where news outlets would suspect the Soviets of using pregnancy as a way to elevate the hormone levels of women to the point where it provides a notable advantage in sports. So much so that it would be akin to literal blood doping. Finnish doctor Risto Erkola went on record in the late 80s stating that it was pretty commonplace among elite female athletes, but there's not a lot of corroboration to these claims. A meta-analysis on all of the claims and evidence regarding abortion doping have also circled back to the conclusion that it's largely a myth surrounded by nothing more than speculative science, and that the drawbacks of pregnancy would be a net negative for athletes in the end anyways, if they were to try something like this in the first place. Double threshold allows athletes to get in a lot of hard volume without completely draining your aerobic engine. However, what if there's a world where you can do infinite threshold? A Norwegian concept that transcends athletics so far that you can increase your aerobic capacities indefinitely. Okay, yeah, this one's a giant meme, but come on, I had to include it. While we briefly touched on the insane era that was women's throwing in the 70s and 80s, there actually lies a rumored mark that, by all accounts, breaks the IAAF scoring system. At a training camp in East Germany, GDR's Martina Hellmann was competing for a spot for the Olympic team, as the camp set up a competition to settle who would go. Not only would Hellmann decimate her previous personal best multiple times, but even broke Gabriela Reinsch's previous world record by throwing 78.14 meters. If we go to the World Athletic scoring tables, it's quite literally off the charts. This throw, though, was not ratified due to it being in an unofficial setting, but if this mark is accurately measured in the end, it is by all accounts the greatest individual mark recorded in athletics history. And state-sponsored doping or not, this throw is still pretty absurd in the end. Bill Bowerman is not only regarded as one of the most prolific coaches in American track and field, but was also the co-founder of Nike. In a biography written about Bowerman's legacy as a coach, there's a brief section dedicated to some interesting initiation practices he would perform on his athletes back when he coached at Oregon. Primarily, peeing on them and branding them with hotkeys. Outside of this book, I couldn't find a single other mention of this other than someone reviewing the book or talking about it in some fashion. Pretty weird that this has any documentation nonetheless. The Ingebrigtsens are one of the most talented families to come out of athletics, and their rise to glory can often be attributed to their father, Jurt. However, in recent years, the brothers have cut ties with their father, citing a long history of alleged abuse. But they do state that there was one particular incident a few years back that ultimately broke the familial bond. Some have speculated that the daughter of the family in question, who was 15 at the time, may have been the victim of the so-called final straw that the brothers mention. In 2022, Jurt took a medical leave from coaching, while also abruptly quit competitive running altogether. While these simultaneous events do line up with the timeline the brothers state as well, this is in the end just pure speculation. But Jurt has been recently charged with bodily harm, with a case that will likely come to a conclusion before the end of March. And that wraps up the track and field iceberg. Let me know if there were any that stood out to you, or maybe there were ones that you found generally interesting. I'm sure there's a decent amount of things I could have included, but I did have to limit myself from constantly adding on to it, because otherwise I'm sure this thing could have almost been infinitely long. Thank you to all of my patrons for supporting the channel, and if you want to support the channel for more content like this, come on over and become a patron, drop a sub, and check out my other links below. I'll see you all in whatever video I upload next, and take care.